This section will be on mental illness. Mental illness. DSM-5. DSM is sometimes referred to as a psychiatrist's Bible. And the reason it's considered that because it has all the different categories of mental illness. And right now we're in the 5th revision of Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. Okay, when you talk about mental illness, there are 4 Ds of mental illness: deviance, distress, dysfunction, and dangerous. Deviance, that just means not norm, doesn't stress from the norm, not someone doesn't look right or someone doesn't dress or doesn't act right. Deviance alone, though, does not necessarily say a person's mentally ill. Distress is basically means that someone doesn't feel good or they're uncomfortable with their situation. But once again, distress alone does not justify saying someone's mentally ill. Dysfunction, in other words, something that person in their life is not working the way it's supposed to. But once again, dysfunction by itself does not necessarily mean one is mentally ill. For instance, talking about erectile dysfunction, a person have a guy can have erectile dysfunction, but still work every day, raise families, do everything. So dysfunction by itself, and then dangerous. Dangerous is another of the 4 Ds. And once again, I would argue a lot of sane people tend to be more dangerous than a lot of your people who are mentally ill. So once again, off of these 4 together justify someone being mentally ill. However, one of these by themselves does not necessarily mean anything. Let's talk about the history of mental illness. And the first person I want to talk about when it comes to history of mental illness is Hippocrates. Hippocrates is considered to be the father of Western medicine. Of course, Hippocrates was educated in Egypt, which a lot of textbooks don't really tell you much about. But however, Hippocrates, his significance was that he believed that mental illness should be treated in the same manner that a physical illness. And he also, one of the first people in Europe who came up with the idea that mental illness is a disorder of the brain, as opposed to bowels or any type of blood disorder, those type of things like that. You got to understand that back in those days, the Greeks believed that mental illness was a result of a roaming uterus. Okay, and we'll talk about that maybe at another time. Then you came the so-called Middle Ages. We're mainly talking about the history of mental illness in Europe. Okay, so it's not the Middle Ages or the Christian era. We're talking about, so from about 1100 to about 1600, late 1600s. And at that time, it was believed that possession was the main cause of mental illness. Possessed by evil spirits or possessed by the devil or possessed by animal spirits. And the solution was bleeding, torturing. I'm sure you heard the phrase, beat the devil out of you. In other words, you make the body an unpleasant place to be. Then those evil spirits would leave. Okay, most people died from the treatments to a certain extent. And then we move further up in history, Paracelsus. He was when he came up with the term lunatic. Okay, in other words, he believed that the moon and the positions of the moon influenced our state of mental health. Okay, you think about things have changed and things haven't changed to a certain degree. In other words, even today, in different cultures, they perform exorcisms. Okay, in other words, remove evil spirits that people possess. Okay, and even to a certain extent, even when we talk about mental illness, if you know anybody who works in the emergency room or a psych ward on the full moon, you see a lot more people coming in with mental health issues. It could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, or it could be something to it. Okay, when you think about the moon in general, the moon, what position it is in the sky determines where high or low tides. So if we control the tides of the ocean, why not be able to control our state of mental health simply because most of our body is water. Next individual we'll talk about is Anton Mesmer. Mesmer came around the time of the discovery of electricity. So we're talking about 1700s, and he believed that we're all surrounded by a magnetic force. Okay, animal magnetism was a phrase he came up with. And Mesmer was one of the first people to use hypnosis. to treat mental illness. One of the first people to use hypnosis to treat mental illness. Then came Charcot. Charcot, 1800s, 1826, 1893. Charcot was one of Freud's teachers. And Charcot was really impressed by Mesmer's research or Mesmer's works. And he was one of the people who used hypnosis to determine whether a person had a real illness or a hysterical illness. In other words, we talk about conversion disorders and dissociative disorders, where a person can have a physical disability, but it's not really physical. And that was one of the things that those are the type of people that Charcot and Freud in his early career worked with, people who exposed to trauma. So a person couldn't walk, but then the x-rays say that they're fine, or a person's paralyzed, but then all the medical examinations say they're okay. So basically what Charcot was saying is that this is all in their head, psychosomatic to a certain extent. And so he would use hypnosis. For instance, a person say they couldn't walk, so he'd put them under hypnosis and then tell them to stand up. Of course, if they can stand up under hypnosis, that meant what? Okay. Next individual we'll talk about is von Kroft Ebbing. Von Kroft Ebbing believed that mental illness, back then they called it paresis, but now we call it psychosis or sometimes schizophrenia. He believed that psychosis was a long-term result of having syphilis. And so he interviewed a lot of his patients, and sure enough, a good deal of them said, yes, I did have syphilis. But then there's a population of them who said they didn't have syphilis. So in order to prove his point, he injected those folks who said they didn't have syphilis with the syphilis virus. And because they didn't have the open sores or the symptoms of early syphilis, he felt that they had already contacted it. Therefore, his theory was viewed correct. Of course, nowadays, that was murder. And also, talking about earlier in the quarter, talking about the reliability of the interview method. Did these patients, when he asked them, did they have syphilis, or these particular ones who told him they had syphilis, did they really understand what he was saying, or were they just saying yes? But either way, during his time, it was a medical breakthrough. But now we see Charcot as being kind of a murderer, giving people, injecting a person with syphilis. And syphilis, cure for syphilis didn't come around until the discovery of penicillin. Okay, so he actually killed these people. As a result of all this, came a movement called moral therapy. Philip Pinel of France, William Tuke of Britain, Benjamin Rush, and Dorothea Dix of the United States all came up with the idea of let's treat mental patients with respect. Moral therapy. Let's treat mental patients with respect. So we're talking about basically the early 1800s. Next main movement or main individual I want to talk about, and which I want to kind of certainly conclude this segment of the study of mental illness, is Emil Kraepelin. Emil Kraepelin basically wrote the first manual or book describing the different types of mental illness. In other words, he predated DSM and inspired to a certain extent DSM. So Kraepelin said that there are different types of mental illness, and they have different categories and different symptoms and different prognoses. And so as a result, he put this booklet with all the different types of mental illness that he knew about at that time. So in other words, Kraepelin pretty much moved the study of mental illness into a science. Also, Kraepelin was a student of Wundt. Remember, first week of class in Psych 100, Wundt, the founder of psychology. So Kraepelin was a student of Wundt.